Hello, my dear friends, by the greetings. Hello, my dear friends, by the greetings in the new year 2021. And today I will be reading interesting article actually. As Santa Claus in January, I need to read something interesting, just entertaining, because many of you just you have some interesting time and nice holidays, vacations. But I found interesting article in English about Japanese nature. Many people in Russia and America and Europe and Asia appreciated Japanese culture and Japanese nature, and are interested in Japanese traditions, and of course all just Japanese image is absolutely wonderful for these people. But I found an interesting article about Japanese wildlife perception and also about Japanese attitude to the nature in comparison with American attitude. So I will be pleased to read it just for discussion, because it's much better to switch on this channel and just listen to the story. So this article and the subject of this discussion today, Japanese perception of wildlife. It was published in the journal Conservation Biology by Stephen Keller, who was working in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in USA in New Haven. And it was published in 1991, 30 years ago, by the way, but still the subject, the problem, and the ideas and thoughts are still existing at the present time. And I'm pleased to share it with you. Okay, let's go to read, and please watch and listen to the story. Japanese perception of wildlife. Telling briefly what I will be talking about. This problem examines how the Japanese public perceives the natural world and the conservation. Actually, mainly wildlife. Limited comparisons were made to the United States and America and Japan. The data was collected in both countries, United States and Japan, using similar conceptual and methodological frameworks. Close-ended surveys were conducted on random samples of Japanese and American publics, and in-depth interviews were conducted with about 50 environmental knowledgeable Japanese people. A central interest was the apparent inconsistency of presumed special Japanese appreciation of nature, concurrent with a pattern of widespread environmental abuse extensively reported in the literature. The results of this study partially elucidate this paradox. The Japanese appreciation for nature was found to be very narrow and idealized, primarily focusing on single species and lacking an ecological and ethical perspective. The Japanese and American publics were both found to possess strong affection for particularly favored species and enjoyed direct environmental contact with similarly pragmatic individual aspects of environment. Both cultures in America and States were similarly pragmatic toward nature and somewhat indifferent regarding the environment when it possessed little emotional value. The Japanese public placed far greater value on satisfaction derived from control and mastery over the nature. Additionally, the Japanese expressed far more or less ethical or ecological concern for nature and wildlife than citizens in the United States of America. Americans also had significantly greater knowledge of wildlife. It was shown in this paper in some interviews and some tests. Let's start from the beginning as introduction. Actually, Japan and the United States are among the leading economic and social powers in the world today. Even it was published 30 years ago, but still now this is the subject. the point. Collectively, these two nations exert enormous socio-economic and political influence, and which measured by such criteria as gross national product, GPN, international trade statistics, and per capita levels of income and consumption. Data was checked in the literature. 1988 data reveal that two countries account for more than 1/3 of a world gross national product, GPN, but comprise just over 7% of the planet's human population. The level of economical activity inevitably results in enormous environmental impacts. More indirectly, the two countries serve as important models of environmental management and conservation, particularly for many of the world's third world nations. Given this level of influence, it is relevant to examine prevailing perceptions in Japan and the United States of America toward the natural world and its management and conservation. This paper, this subject of discussion, offers some data regarding one particularly important aspect of environmental values and perceptions: attitude toward wildlife and its conservation. Previous research using a similar conceptual and methodological framework explored attitudes toward wildlife in the United States, Germany, and such countries as Botswana were conducted in different countries. This article, this paper, reviews the results of the research conducted in Japan in 1987 that was employed for this study approach. Due to the space limitation of this data, this comparison compared only with the results obtained in the United States. Let's take background information about Japan. The Japanese population in this time, in 1991, was about 123 million of people, making Japan the world's 7th most populous nation, with roughly 2.4% of the planet's human inhabitants, as indicated by Yano 1984. Japan's population growth has been relatively modest, comparable to what was found in other industrially developed nations. Still, the Japanese population has nearly quadrupled during the past century, from the year 1870, total of just 32 million. The size of Japanese human population is underscored by the nation's population density, roughly about 323 persons per 1 kilometer, in contrast to 248 persons in Germany and 25 in United States. Data on 1985 year. Moreover, in relation to existing arable land, the Japanese population is an extraordinary 1,256 persons on 1 square kilometer, compared with 820 in Germany and 103 in the United States. 3/4 of Japanese populations resides in urban areas. The population density of some sections of Tokyo exceeding 20,000 persons per 1 square kilometer. This very uneven population distribution has resulted in nearly 2/3 of the country, mainly the mountainous areas, having less than 50 people per 1 square kilometer. What's about Japanese gross national product? Japan's gross national product, GPN, in 1988 was approximately 1.8 trillion, making it the world's third largest economy after the United States and in this time still the Soviet Union. Economical growth statistics has been particularly impressive. Japan's GPN in 1960 was $306 billion, and the country's export increased from $4.1 billion in 1960 to $264.9 billion in 1988. Despite national industrial succession, in 1988, the country still has 4.44 million people engaged in agriculture, more than 5 million people engaged in agriculture, compared with 3.3 million in the United States, which has roughly twice the population like in United States. Japanese society also differs greatly from the United States and is much heavier reliance on fish products. Japan is the world's largest per capita consumer of fish and the second largest fishing nation, as it was indicated in a report of Japanese Environmental Agency. Although Japan has a relatively large human population of a small geographical area, the country possesses a comparatively rich and diverse biota. Compared to the areas of similar size like the Great Britain and New Zealand, the number of species is large in Japan, as indicated in the report of Japanese Environmental Agency. 122 mammal species have been identified in Japan, compared with 67 in Great Britain and Ireland. They are roughly similar in size. Over 600 bird species, including 100 subspecies, have been reported in Japan, again roughly double the number found in Great Britain and Ireland. The unusually large number of herpetological species occur in Japan, amphibians and reptilia, including 84 reptiles and 58 amphibian species. The endemicity of salamanders is especially remarkable. It includes the world's largest amphibian, the largest giant salamander, in Latin language Andreas japonicum. The giant salamander is one of a relatively large species of unique relic species which once found in mainland Asia that migrated and adapted to the ecological conditions of Japanese islands. Other notably endemics include the Japanese snow monkey, in Latin language Macaca fuscata, the species of cerro, in Latin language Capricornis crispus, the antelope-like animal, the crested ibis, the bird, in Latin language Nipponia nippon, and Iriomoto cat, nice cat living in Iriomote Island in the south of Japan. In Latin language, Maialurus iriomotensis. Maialurus iriomotensis. The Japanese is the country which is also exceptional for its many insect species, entomological diversity, having roughly 4 or 5 times the number more than it's found in Great Britain, although precise figures are still unknown. This exceptional biological diversity is largely a consequence of Japanese considerable biogeographical variation in its oceanic character. Three characteristics of the Japanese archipelago are especially important. The nation's highly mountainous terrain, its broad latitudes variation, and the large number of islands in Japan. These factors are resulted in substantial climatic and habitat variation. The Japanese latitudinal range is approximately from about 3,000 kilometers, roughly equivalent to the distance from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia to Key West in Florida. The latitudinal range is about more than 20 degrees from the boreal to subalpine regions of Hokkaido at 45.5 north to the neotropical islands of Okinawa is the Ryukyu chain, which is roughly about 27 north degree. Japanese roughly mountainous terrain and recent volcanic activity are suggested by the fact that more than 3/4 of Japanese archipelago consist of mountains. More than 24 of these have elevations of greater than 3,000 meters, and 55% of mountainous areas possesses a gradient of greater than 14 degrees. The Japanese archipelago consists of some of 3,900 islands, and has a total coastline of nearly 33,000 kilometers. Coastline is 33,000 kilometers, while Japan represents about 1 of 400 of a planet's terrestrial surface. Its shoreline is the second or the third of any country of the world. These exceptional latitudinal, elevational, and coastal features have created the basis for much of Japanese diversity of plants and animals. Let's talk about Japanese people and the nature. It is frequently has been asserted that the Japanese culture has been especially with high regard, appreciation, and affection for the nature, as it was indicated in many papers and in large scale of literature. The notion of relatively unique Japanese harmony with nature has been suggested by evidence in religion, in art, literature, and from traditional rituals and customs. It is cited some expressions of this appreciation include Japanese traditions of Shintoism, flower arranging, plant cultivation like bonsai, the tea ceremony, haiku, and other poetry forms, rock gardening, various celebrations of the seasons, and of course, reverential focus on particular features of environment, among others. The author Watanabe in 1974 remarked that a basic characteristic of Japanese culture is the love of nature, which has resulted in a a refined appreciation of the beauty of nature, a view of man considered as a part of nature, and the art of living in harmony with nature as the wisdom of life. Such author as Murata in 1985 indicated this perspective with predominant views in Europe and North America. Like that, the Japanese view of nature is quite different from the Westerners. The Japanese nature is an old persuasive force. Nature is one of a blessed and friend of the Japanese people. People in Western countries, on the other hand, view nature as an object and often as the entity set in the opposition to the humankind. Such author as Saito, in the paper published in 1983, identified three important features of this traditional Japanese attitude toward nature. First attitude: nature as a friend of man, instead of servant to be used, as an enemy to be subdued, or an obstacle to be overcome. The second: there is no fundamental difference between man and nature. And the third one: the relationship between man and nature is harmonious and unified. The Japanese appreciation of nature has been cited as a major reason for the relatively large proportion of a nation being designated as national park and other protected areas in Japan. Nevertheless, despite claims of special Japanese respect and appreciation, or even the love of nature, current evidences exist in widespread Japanese abuses of the environment, as well as apparent indifference towards sound resource conservation and management practices, and it also indicated in many articles in literature and newspapers published worldwide by different authors in different countries, and so on. Japan has been prominently identified in many literature resources as a primary contributor in many areas of global environmental and wildlife destruction, including damaging whaling practices, then excessive wildlife product exploitation, like ivory, tortoise shell, and musk, in harmful high sea level drift net use for fishing, and extensive tropical forest destruction. The Japanese have registered more exceptions than other nations in the ruling of Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, and until quite recently had no internal law for the protection of endangered and threatened species. Japan's destructive environmental impacts prompted one conservationist to refer to Japanese as environmental terrorists, and it was cited by Snyder in 1989, as it was published in this paper of Snyder. Let's see Snyder. The paper was named "Japan Assailing for Practices That Damage Global Environment," as it was published in Christian Science Monitor in 1989. Although a relatively large proportion of Japan has been designated as protected natural area, much of the land is afflicted by extensive human development, as indicated by many authors in Japan. This apparent paradox of presumed Japanese appreciation and respect for the nature, concurrent with a pattern of repeated environmental and wildlife destruction, has puzzled many scholars in different papers, in articles, in journals, in books. The result of this article, this study, as well as additional literature review, are offering to provide some explanation of this paradox. It will be suggested that Japanese appreciation and respect to the nature has tended to be very narrow and idealized, primarily focusing on single species and individual aspects of the environment, and typically lacking an ecological and ethical perspective. Let's talk about study of Japanese attitudes, knowledge, and behavior. The data discussed in this article was collected from 1986 to 1987. Two primary methodologies were used. It is a closely ended survey of a Japanese public, and in-depth interviews with a sample of Japanese recommended as having an extensive knowledge of Japanese attitude toward nature. The design was conducted of a survey for Japanese public was methodologically similar to previous investigation in the United States and in Germany, as it was published in the articles of Keller in 1979, 1980, and published by Schultz in 1985. A list will be cited in the literature. The Japanese survey required an average 43 minutes to administer and was conducted in person. The survey consisted of 198 closely ended questions on the following topics. For example, basic attitudes toward nature and animals, attitude toward wildlife management and conservation, knowledge of animals, awareness of wildlife conservation issues, behavioral interactions with animals and nature, and respondent demographical characteristics. This survey was pre-tested in the United States and in Japan. A bilingual research assistant participated in the pre-testing and in translation of the survey. This is not only English-speaking test, but also Japanese-speaking test. A Japanese research company was hired to assist in the translation of some questions and this survey, pre-testing in selection of random samples, personal interview training, data collecting, in interview verification, and in data coding. Faculty member of Kyoto University and the National Institute of Statistics Mathematics participated in the survey design. Funding of the survey was provided by G.R. Dodge Foundation, the Yale University Center for International Area Studies, and the Fulbright Council for International Exchange of Scholars, Japan-US Commission. The closed-ended survey was administered to 450 randomly selected Japanese people in the summer of 1986. Because of a limited sample size and cost involved, data collection was confined to 4 primary sample cities: in Tokyo, in Toyosaka, Niigata, Miyako, Iwate, Nakashibetsu, and Hokkaido. Tokyo was selected as a representative of Japanese urban area. The other sample locations were considered rural by Japanese standards and were selected to represent areas known for rice production, fisheries, and dairy farming. Each rural area was minimally about 155 kilometers from a city of more than 1 million people and 80 kilometers from urban cities, areas of more than 500,000 population. The location of each sample site was acquiescently selected for sample selection purposes from a list of national census zones, for each zone consisting of roughly 50 households. Within each sample selection, quotas for age, sex, and educational level were met according to population statistics. Personal interviews were conducted with a single randomly selected individual within the randomly selected household.